Welcome back, everyone. We're coming to our last guest presenter this afternoon. Nate Storey is the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of Plenty. He's really the science and technology genius behind a number of innovations in this space over the years. He's an academic turned entrepreneur, and he brings a really deep understanding of the opportunities, the obstacles, the limitations ahead for vertical agriculture to address many of the topics that we've been discussing today. So without further ado, here's Nate Storey.
Thank you. Let me share my screen here and get us kicked off. So today I'm going to talk about access and the future of vertical farming. I'm going to spend a lot of my time talking about access because access is kind of at the heart of why vertical farming must exist. But just a quick intro. My name is Nate Storey. I'm the Chief Science Officer. I'm one of the co-founders at Plenty. We're a vertical farming company, and we exist to improve the lives of people, plants, and planet. And much of the reason that we exist is because we think it's high time for a second agricultural revolution. The first 10,000 years or the last 10,000 years of our existence, we have spent an incredible amount of time and energy and focus trying to control nature, this fundamentally uncontrollable force. And the result of that kind of culminated in the first green revolution of the 60s and bleeding into modern day as we're using tractors and irrigation, genetics, modern genetics. We have these massive fields that are very well-controlled, uniform conditions across the field. We've leveraged pesticides and fertilizers. We've leveraged all these different tools to try and master nature and to try and gain control, because we've learned that as we have more control, we can drive yield and we can have more predictable outcomes. The problem, though, is that that first green revolution helped us solve for kind of the first order problem of humanity. You know, how do we create enough calories for all of the people on the planet? But it still left us malnourished. And today we're seeing this rising tide of diet-based diseases or diseases that stem from poor diets. And we have still this problem, which is, I think, abhorrent to pretty much anyone in agriculture, of a world that still has unequal access to food, and not just calories, but also nutritious food. Today food is still at the heart of so many diseases and many deaths around the world. Food and food access, healthy food, is access to that is still a huge problem. And we live in this kind of tragic irony of people dying simultaneously around the world of hunger, and people dying around the world of too much in the way of calories. And so we've kind of got this excess and we have this lack, and they live side by side. And a lot of that has to do with the food that we can grow and where we can grow food. And that is really what Plenty is on a mission to solve. A quick side note here is that the COVID has had a massive impact on access to food. And we've seen it here in the US. And if you can imagine the dramatic impact that COVID's had in the US, you can imagine how much more dramatic that is in areas of the world that depend on import for food, and in many cases export as well, when it comes to people's livelihood. So all of that to say, this is a huge problem. In order to give people enough fresh fruits and vegetables, we basically need to triple the world's supply. We need to triple the world's supply of fresh fruits and vegetables. That's problematic, though, because we can only grow fresh fruits and vegetables in certain parts of the world economically. And these are places where we can control soil conditions, where we have access to mechanization, we have access to the tools that allow us to grow at high density and control the conditions of the soil. And they also tend to have pretty moderate environments. And so what this has driven then is import and export economies when it comes to fresh fruits and vegetables. And here in the US, you can see that we've used our purchasing power to go and gobble up more of the world's supply of fresh fruits and vegetables. And amazingly, this is also a concern for our own supply of fresh fruits and vegetables, we are importing more and more and more as people begin to consume more. So that's good that we're eating more fresh fruits and vegetables, but it means that people in other places have less, because we are unfortunately trapped in a relatively zero-sum game when it comes to fresh fruits and vegetables. So in short, we need more land, but we need land that doesn't exist. And frankly, you know, where agriculture has been expanding to of late, think soybeans in the Amazon, think you know, palm plantations in the jungles of Borneo. These are places that we want to protect. These are not places that we think should be clear-cut to grow soybean for hogs. So we don't have enough land. We don't have enough water. So aquifers are being depleted at alarming rates. And just generally speaking, you know, we have this interesting scenario where we need to grow more, but we just can't. We don't have the resources to do it. And it's driven this global trade, which has proven to be very, very fragile this year. But it's also not just a risk from a fragility standpoint, it's also, it has an impact on the nutrition of the food that we consume. So that's why vertical farming exists. That's why plenty exists. And you know, at the risk of sounding pretentious here, I think that, you know, vertical farming has the ability to usher in kind of the next big revolution in agriculture. So when we think about what plenty does, we create new farmland, but we do it in a way that is divorced from the resource demands of the field. And you know, what I mean by that is we use a fraction of the water. So our current ratio of basically plenty land to field land is 1 to 720. So use, you know, a fraction of what is necessary to generate the same productivity in the field. We use much less water, so around, you know, 1% of the water that you would use in the field, we end up using. And the reason for that is we grow in these vertical planes, and you can kind of see a picture here off to the side, but we can pack a lot of production into a very small space. And then all of the water that's transpired, we capture, we condense it, and we circulate it back into the system. So we don't have really that much water waste. We're insulated from extreme weather events. So, you know, think about a warming planet, think about climate change and more extreme weather events. And we start to think about what we do is saving water, saving land, saving these resources, and also kind of being a bit of an insurance policy for humanity. And then, you know, the greens that we produce are very clean, very fresh, because they are not exposed to some of the uncontrolled elements of the field. So we've done this by investing very heavily in R&D, and we've built this this tech stack that has kind of this unique architecture of these vertical walls. We're growing on both sides. We've been breeding plants, so we go back and we look at a lot of oftentimes heirloom genetics, and we figure out how we take those genetics and make them applicable in our farms to bring great flavor and nutrition. And we screen a lot. So we go through a lot of these old genetics to try and understand what works the best. Then we use a lot of interesting tools for managing and analyzing and making our data actionable, and then lots of robotics. So, you know, as we start to think about what that does for access, you know, I think, you know, the farm that we're building right now is a great example. So we are building a farm right now down in Compton, in LA. And, you know, I am particularly fond of Compton because it has this rich agricultural history. But now it's extremely urban, extremely dense. There's not a whole lot of green space. There's not a whole lot of, you're not going to walk into Compton and find fields of vegetables, but that's what Compton used to be. And so I think it's kind of fitting that we're going down there, we're building a farm in a place that used to be a farm, and we're generating jobs and creating access to fresh, kind of these fresh healthy vegetables down there. We're really focused on leafy greens today, but by and large, the vertical farming industry is maturing very quickly. And I think Plenty is kind of leading the pack, but I think that we can anticipate a lot of farms that are moving into new crops. So Plenty right now is working on strawberries. We've been breeding tomato for a while, and then we've been screening lots of fruits like other crops like eggplant and peppers and kind of your other common greenhouse crops. But there's virtually no limit to the crops that can be grown indoors. And as we see the economics of these farms improve dramatically, as we see, you know, renewable energy prices, you know, drop to fantastically low rates below those of kind of conventional energy, there is a world where tree fruit and root crops and all sorts of other amazing things move indoors. So I know I only have 15 minutes, so that's that. Hopefully I am roughly on time.
Thanks, Nate. You are absolutely on time, and I am here to field some questions. Professor Matthew Hayek of NYU pointed out to us today that we should really be paying attention to the carbon emissions of food production. How do emissions compare from sort of field to indoor vertical from your calculations at this point?
That's a really great question, and it's been the chief criticism of vertical farming so far, right? We use a lot of electricity in production. What I will say is when we run the numbers of basically carbon emissions from field farming, because carbon emissions from field farming are pretty significant, especially when you compare the land to its best and highest use, which is like a natural landscape. We're roughly 1-to-1. So we're currently about the equivalent, and for every kilogram of production that we do, we're about the equivalent of the field, and it's coming down. So I anticipate over the next several years we'll be at a fraction of what the field is from a carbon emission standpoint.
Okay. I read this last week that somebody was saying that the holy grail in the vertical farming space is the cost and operating cost of the light bulb at the end of the day. Is that true? The LED, that there needs to be a step function improvement in the efficiency of the lighting, or do you feel like you're pretty much there to get into that cost competitive or cost advantage space?
Yeah, that was true about 6 years ago.
Okay.
It's not true today. So where Plenty is at today, it costs us less to per acre equivalent of farm that we build than it would take for us to go buy and operate land. So, at the farm level, we're currently beating the field on economics. That being said, LEDs are on cost curves. And so in order to understand why vertical farming makes sense today and didn't even 5 or 6 years ago, you have to understand the cost curve of all the technology inputs that go into the business. So, think about LEDs, think about deployed AI, think about data, sensor technology. So the ability to collect data, store it, manage it, make it actionable. All of the costs of these things are on cost curves, which means they're a fraction of the cost that they were even a year or two ago. So our costs are coming down very, very quickly.
There's a ton of questions, and many of them I think we won't have time for because we're always pushing up against the clock. But just relating to our last conversation was really about community and access and affordability. Somebody's asking about what did Plenty do in terms of community outreach to join the Compton community, or how did the company think about bringing sort of a high-tech, probably white-centric management team into a community like Compton in Los Angeles?
That's a great question. So we really do view these farms as part of kind of the fabric of the community. And in Compton, we kind of jumped in with both feet. So we worked with kind of the schools down there to do outreach to the schools with some of the kids. And I view that as kind of a long-term approach to training people, teaching people about plants, about farming, about gardening, about growing your own food, getting people interested, right? Sparking that interest in those kids' minds. And then, we've been working with folks who are involved in community gardens down there and figuring out how we can support them and get more people volunteering. Also, a portion of the produce that we grow is designated for those local corner stores, local grocery stores, wherever we can kind of distribute that. So, that's, kind of the supply focused, work, but we end up hiring a lot of folks from this community, right? And I think over time, these farms get viewed as kind of a fundamental part of that community. We're growing next door to people that are consuming, and oftentimes we're employing them. So
One of the things that's come out in the symposium that I think bears repeating is that we're really looking at both and solutions and mindsets. You know, there's a resurgence of energy in the organic movement now. There's a mobilization of a group called Real Organic that's trying to get back to some of the certifications. And I know there's some tension between whether vertical farming will be able to be claimed, especially hydroponic, will be able to be claimed as organic. How do you think about that, both from a business perspective and a cultural perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be a tad radical on the environmental side of the spectrum. And so I would say, you know, the best and highest use of land is in its natural state. That's my personal belief. And so as we think about, you know, any form of farming, you know, we are using that land suboptimally. Any type of farming, I think we could argue, is a suboptimal use of that land. So, you know, when we think about vertical farming and how it stacks up against things like organic, I think that the larger question is, you know, how do humans live on this planet in a way that is less impactful? And how, as a species, can we have less of an impact on the world, on the environment, all of these different things? And so that's really kind of why I'm in vertical farming to a large degree. That being said, you know, conventional farming has to continue. Like, there are hungry mouths to feed. We have to feed people. But I will say, you know, organic farming came about because people wanted food that they thought was safer, cleaner, environmentally friendly, food that was grown responsibly, and they wanted some degree of accountability, right? They want to know that someone who cares about them is growing this food, and there's accountability between me as a consumer and you as a producer. And so when I look at vertical farming, for me, vertical farming does all of that, right? We produce safe, clean food. We produce it next door. We produce it in ways that are environmentally friendly and getting friendlier every single day. And there's a high degree of accountability.
It's fantastic. I think we're going to, for the next symposium, tee up a conversation that will bring back Professor Robai from the Netherlands, who's an expert in ethics. And she was talking to us about displaced problems early. So we're a problem to another part of the food system. But there's a pressing question, this will be our last question, Nate, about how are you going to scale this? We know that Plenty was one of the first companies to get a gigantic slug of capital from some very high profile investors that made people's heads turn. Is this going to be a really capital intensive scale up, or what's the strategy? How do farms like Plenty's actually begin to make an impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's primarily capital constrained, right? So Plenty, especially because we've spent the last several years doing the hard work, the research, the R&D, you know, perfecting kind of the science of growing in this way. And so, you know, from here on out, you know, we are going to have to deploy a massive amount of capital in order to build all of the farms that we have to build to feed all the people we have to feed.
And is that going to require a different kind of time frame or time horizon, different expectations of time horizons for these types of investments?
I think once it gets started, it's going to go incredibly fast. But, you know, we're talking about building infrastructure, the infrastructure equivalent of, you know, capacity 3 times or 2 times, I guess, the world's fresh fruit and vegetable agricultural capacity today. That is a massive, massive project.
So it's really important for you that the governments and populations of the world value fruits and vegetables with the true cost that it takes to produce them. This is a great segue for tomorrow, because tomorrow we've got another full day, but with a focus on entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship, and capital providers. So Nate, thanks so much for being with us. It's a pleasure to get to meet you and hear from you. Really appreciate it.